On April 1st, 2026, 4 astronauts climbed into a spacecraft named Integrity and left Earth. They flew farther than any human in over 50 years.
And then the third is looking at the moon itself from a vantage point where humans haven't looked for over 50 years.
Circled the moon and came home alive, but that return was bought with blood.
The return as well as recovery, all of the sleeping and awake time, we do all of that in one block.
Every hardware on that spacecraft was designed around a dead body, 31 of them. Men who burned, suffocated, and fell with no way out. We celebrate the launch and the countdown, but the road to Artemis II is not paved with triumph. It is paved with coffins.
Top space agency officials are flying to Cape Kennedy tonight to begin the official investigation into what caused a flash fire that killed the nation's first 3 Apollo astronauts earlier tonight.
This is the story of the men who never came back so Artemis II could succeed, and it will break you down piece by piece. The oxygen that became fire. Artemis II did not begin on April 1, 2026. It began on January 27, 1967, inside a spacecraft that was never supposed to reach the moon. Apollo 1 was not a lunar mission. It was the test phase, a basic capsule meant to stay in Earth orbit and prove that the systems worked before NASA risked sending anyone to the moon.
One of the problems I remember encountering it was in the system I was responsible for were the thrusters.
It was supposed to be safe, controlled, routine. That morning did not feel like a day anyone would die. At Launch Complex 34 in Cape Kennedy, Florida, a crew climbed into that spacecraft, sealed the hatch, and began a test they had done before. Some of them had already made quiet, final jokes about not trusting the machine they were sitting in. None of them were meant to die that day.
When they closed that hatch, everybody said, "Good Lord, man, I'm glad that's over."
But everything that would one day carry humans safely around the moon began here, in a test that turned into something no one inside could escape. What surrounded these men inside that sealed cabin was enough to kill them. The cabin was filled with 100% pure oxygen, pushed above normal pressure. That changed everything. In normal air, a small spark might burn and die. In that cabin, it would spread fast, feeding on everything around it, turning wires, padding, and even the smallest materials into fuel within seconds.
Top space agency officials are flying to Cape Kennedy tonight to begin the official investigation into what caused a flash fire that killed the nation's first 3 Apollo astronauts earlier tonight.
That was the environment NASA sealed 3 men inside and called it a routine test day. Inside the capsule sat a crew who should not have died like this. Gus Grissom had already proven himself. He was America's second man in space, a veteran of Mercury and commander of Gemini 3. Many believed he would have been the first man on the moon. Ed White had stepped into open space during Gemini 4 and floated outside the spacecraft for 23 minutes. He did not want to come back. Mission Control had to order him again and again.
Come on, let's go back in here before it gets dark. Come on now. Okay, you have a message for us, Houston?
Yeah, get back in.
When he finally pulled himself back in and closed the hatch, he later said it was the saddest moment of his life because he had just left the one place where he felt completely free, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He did not know that one day that same kind of hatch would trap him inside. And then there was Roger B. Chaffee, only 31, still waiting for his first flight, still believing this was the beginning. Grissom did not trust the spacecraft. He complained to engineers, to other astronauts, to anyone who would listen. At a press conference, when asked what success would look like, he answered without smiling that getting his crew home alive would be enough. The room laughed. They thought it was dry humor. It was not.
Gus Grissom spoke with me earlier about his own philosophy on what risks he took while being an astronaut.
The night before the test, Wally Schirra, one of the most respected astronauts in the program, pulled Grissom aside and said quietly, "If you get the slightest glitch, get out of there. I don't like it." Grissom heard him. He was terrified, but there was no real way to walk away now, not with everything already set in motion. The crew even posed for a photo, heads bowed like they were praying, and sent it to Joe Shea, the man in charge of the program, with the message, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head."
I look forward a great deal to the first flight. There's a great deal of pride involved in making a first flight.
They tried to pass it off as a joke, but it felt like something else, like they were quietly handing their safety over to God, because deep down, They were no longer sure anyone else could protect them. 5 days earlier, on January 22nd, Grissom stood in his backyard in Texas and picked a lemon from a tree. His wife Betty asked what he planned to do with it. "I'm going to hang it on that spacecraft," he said. He did exactly that when he arrived at the Cape. He was laughing when he said it, but something inside him was not at ease. And still he went into that rocket with the rest of the crew, and the doomed test began. The test itself dragged. The crew reported a foul smell in the oxygen supply. It took an hour to fix. Communications kept failing. At one point, Grissom snapped, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" The countdown stalled again at 5:40 p.m. Everyone waited. No one stopped the test. By 6:31 p.m., they were preparing to continue. Then it happened. It started with a spark, most likely from a frayed wire under Grissom's seat, possibly linked to his open microphone. In normal air, that kind of spark might have burned a small section and died. But inside that cabin, filled with pure oxygen under pressure, it spread instantly, feeding on everything around it, turning the air itself into fuel. At 6:31 p.m., a voice came over the radio. "Fire! I smell fire!" It sounded almost calm, like someone noticing something small. 2 seconds later, the tone changed. "Fire in the cockpit!" Now it was urgent. Then the final transmission came through, broken and desperate. "We've got a bad fire. Let's get out. We're burning up." And then came a terrifying scream. It was long, raw scream of pain that cut through the line. At 6 hours 31 minutes and 22 seconds p.m., everything went silent. 9 seconds. That was all they had. Inside, everything burned at once. Nylon netting, Velcro, foam padding, wiring. The fire moved faster than thought. Ed White went straight for the hatch. That was his responsibility. But the hatch design worked against him. It had 6 bolts that had to be loosened one by one using a single ratchet, and even in perfect conditions, it took at least 90 seconds to open. As the fire grew, the pressure inside the cabin rose rapidly, forcing the inward opening hatch tighter into its frame with every second. At 6 hours 31 minutes and 19 seconds p.m., just 6 seconds after the first report of fire, the pressure reached 29 psi and ruptured the inner wall of the capsule. Evidence later showed White had managed to make part of one turn on the ratchet before the heat and smoke overwhelmed him. Grissom was reaching for the emergency pressure valve, trying to bring the pressure down enough to make the hatch movable. But the flames were already between him and the control. They were trapped with no way out. Outside, 27 technicians ran toward the capsule. They were hit by heat so intense they had to pull back. Smoke filled their lungs. Some could not even see their hands. Others feared the launch escape system would ignite and blow the entire structure apart. Still, some stayed and kept trying. They fought to reach the hatch. It took 5 minutes. 5 minutes from the first word fire before they could finally open it. By then, it was over. All 3 crew members were dead. They did not die the way most people imagine. They were overcome by toxic gases, suffocating inside a sealed metal chamber. Their suits had melted under the heat. Parts of them had fused to the interior of the cabin. It took 6 hours before anyone could begin the slow, painful process of removing their bodies. The investigation tore everything open. More than 1,400 safety problems were identified. Many were already known by North American aviation. Some were known by NASA. One of the most disturbing findings was simple and hard to accept. The test itself had not even been classified as hazardous. Frank Borman would later admit, "I don't believe that any of us recognized that the test conditions for this test were hazardous." That is what makes it worse. The danger was there the entire time, sitting in plain view, and no one fully faced what it could do until it was too late. And then came the cruel truth that is almost impossible to ignore. In 1961, during his Mercury flight, Grissom nearly died when his capsule hatch blew open after splashdown. NASA changed the design to prevent that from ever happening again. They removed the explosive bolts. They made it open inward. They made it harder to open. That same redesign is what trapped him in 1967. The same problem that almost killed him once is what killed him the second time. After the fire, NASA shut down crewed Apollo flights for 20 months. They redesigned everything. The hatch became quick release. The oxygen mix was changed. Flammable materials were removed. The spacecraft was rebuilt from the inside out. Grissom and Chaffee were buried at Arlington. White was buried at West Point, as he had requested. Launch Complex 34 was abandoned in 1969. It still stands today, rusting, overgrown, with a sign that reads, "Abandoned in place." 3 stone benches sit there. Every year, families come back. And yet one detail still sits in the dark. The Apollo 1 command module was never put on display. It was locked away, moved from one secure storage site to another. It still exists, hidden, untouched. Why? What exactly does it show that no one wants the public to see? Now ask the question that hurts the most. Could this have been prevented? Because 6 years earlier, on the other side of the world, a man had already died in the same way. Same oxygen, same kind of fire, same kind of mistake. 6 years before Apollo 1, on March 23, 1961, a 24-year-old Soviet trainee named Valentin Bondarenko was locked inside an oxygen-rich pressure chamber in Moscow. He was the youngest of the original cosmonaut group. It was the 10th day of a 15-day endurance test. The air inside was loaded with oxygen, enough to turn anything into fuel. That night he finished his work, removed sensors from his skin, and wiped himself with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball. Without thinking, he tossed it aside. It landed on a small electric hot plate he was using to make tea. It caught fire instantly. He tried to beat it out with his sleeve. The sleeve ignited. Within seconds, the fire spread across his body. The doctor outside could not reach him. The pressure inside the chamber kept the door sealed. It took nearly 30 minutes to open it. By the time they pulled him out, his body was covered in severe burns. He was still conscious, still aware. As they carried him out, he kept repeating, "It was my fault. Don't blame anyone." He died 16 hours later. Sitting beside him was Yuri Gagarin, his fellow trainee and friend, part of the same program competing to become the first man in space. 3 weeks later, Gagarin was chosen. He flew. He became the first human in orbit. The world celebrated him. No one knew Bondarenko had died the same way men would die again in America. The Soviet government erased him. His death was kept secret for 25 years. He died in the same kind of oxygen-rich fire for the same reason 6 years before Apollo 1. If that truth had been shared, it might have forced changes. It might have saved lives. The quick-release hatch, the safer air mix, the fire-resistant materials now built into Artemis II exist because those warnings were finally paid for in blood. But Apollo 1 was not the only fire. It was not even the first. Across the world, on the other side of the space race, the Soviets had already lost men in ways that the world was not allowed to know. And the silence that surrounded those deaths made the cost of space even higher. The man who flew because his friend would have died. On April 24, 1967, just 3 months after Apollo 1, Vladimir Komarov, an experienced Soviet cosmonaut and test pilot, climbed into Soyuz 1 knowing something was wrong. The Soviet government wanted to prove its power in space. Soyuz 1 would launch first. Then Soyuz 2 would launch the next day with another crew. The 2 spacecraft were supposed to fly up into space, dock together, and show the world that the Soviet Union could control space better than anyone else. But behind that plan, more than 200 technical problems had already been documented. Engineers had already warned the spacecraft was not ready. Komarov knew. So did his backup pilot, Yuri Gagarin, the most famous man in the world, the first human to ever leave Earth. Gagarin understood the danger and tried to take Komarov's place, hoping the mission would be cancelled rather than risk him. It failed. The launch went ahead. When asked why he did not refuse to fly, Komarov gave an answer that still cuts deep. If he refused, Gagarin would go in his place. He would not let his friend die for him. So he took the seat, knowing what it could cost. Almost immediately, things began to fail. One solar panel did not deploy, cutting power in half. The attitude control system broke down. The spacecraft began to spin. For more than a day, Komarov fought it, alone, trying to stabilize it, trying to line it up for re-entry, trying to survive something that was already falling apart around him. Somehow he managed to bring it back into position. Then everything failed at once. The main parachute did not deploy. The container had been built wrong. The lines caught and would not release. The backup parachute tangled with it. There was nothing left. Soyuz 1 slammed into the ground at roughly 40 meters per second. When the recovery team arrived, they found burned metal and what remained of a man who had carried that decision all the way to the end. Accounts from inside the program describe his final moments as filled with anger. He shouted, cursed the engineers, cursed the system that sent him up in a broken machine. Then his voice broke. He wailed and screamed, "I am scared, I am really going to die." As the ground came closer, he fell knowing it did not have to happen. And what happened next is what makes this even harder to take. Yuri Gagarin lived on, but not the same way. People said his smile never truly reached his eyes again. 11 months later, at just 34, he died in a jet crash. The man Komarov chose to save did not even make it a year. 4 years later, on June 30th, 1971, it happened again. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev were Soviet cosmonauts returning from the Soyuz 11 mission. They had just spent 22 days aboard Salyut 1, the world's first space station, sent there to prove humans could live and work in space for long periods. They had broken every endurance record. They were coming home as heroes. But there was a known compromise. The capsule was too small for 3 men to wear pressure suits. Without suits, there was nothing to protect them if the cabin lost air. A suit would have sealed their bodies, kept oxygen around them, kept them alive. Without it, they were completely exposed. Everyone knew this. They flew anyway. As the capsule separated for re-entry, a pressure valve the size of a coin opened too early. That small opening began to drain all the air out of the cabin into space. In seconds, the pressure dropped. The air they needed to breathe was being pulled away from them. They found the valve. They tried to close it, but their bodies were already failing. The lack of pressure meant their blood could not carry oxygen. Their lungs could not work. Their ears and chest were under violent stress. Within 30 seconds, they blacked out. Within 2 minutes, they were dead. The autopsy would later reveal burst blood vessels in their brains and hemorrhaging in their eardrums from the explosive decompression. The capsule continued down perfectly. The parachute opened. It landed softly, exactly as planned. When the recovery team opened the hatch, they were smiling, ready to welcome them back. Then they saw them. Dead heroes, still strapped in, blue-faced, silent. The recovery team broke down. Some cried openly. Some reached in, held them, hugged them, calling their names, hoping for anything. But there was nothing left to save. The program stopped for 2 years. When it returned, nothing was treated as acceptable risk anymore. From that point on, cosmonauts wore pressure suits during launch and re-entry. The Soyuz spacecraft was also redesigned to carry only 2, just to make room for survival. Every crewed spacecraft that followed had to follow that rule. The suits worn today exist because of that moment. The Orion Crew Survival System suits worn by Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen on Artemis II on April 1, 2026 are built on that same lesson. They are the answer to what happened inside Soyuz 11. And there is one more detail that makes it harder to accept. The Soyuz 11 crew were not even supposed to be there. They were the backup crew, inserted just days before launch after the prime crew was removed over a health concern. They stepped into a mission with known risks, with little time to prepare, and paid for it. The Americans and Soviets had now each paid with blood. Each program had buried its men and promised to do better. Then came the shuttle era, and it would take more blood. 73 brutal seconds on Challenger. On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of children sat in classrooms across America watching a live broadcast. Their teacher was going to space. Krista McAuliffe had been chosen from over 11,000 applicants. She had prepared lessons she would teach from orbit, speaking directly to students like them. This mission was meant to prove something simple. Space had become safe enough that an ordinary teacher could go. The crew stood ready. Francis Scobie, Michael J. Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, and Gregory Jarvis. There is one detail about this crew that almost nobody knew. Ronald McNair was not just an astronaut. He was a physicist with a PhD from MIT, and also a deeply gifted jazz saxophonist. He had been working with Jean-Michel Jarre on a piece of music he planned to perform in space. It would have been the first original music ever recorded in orbit. He believed in it. He practiced constantly. Even when he was sick with the flu, he still rehearsed. He wanted to get it right. He wanted to show what humanity could be. On the morning of the launch, he called his colleague one last time. "Okay, this is D-Day. We're going to lift off this afternoon. Watch us launch on TV, and I'll see you in a few weeks." 73 seconds later, he would be gone. The music was never played in space. The mission itself, STS-51L, was meant to deploy a satellite, run experiments, and show that spaceflight had become routine. That was the promise, that it was safe. But that morning was dangerously cold. Temperatures had dropped as low as 8 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. By launch, it was still freezing. That mattered more than anyone watching understood. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off. For just over a minute, everything looked normal. Then, at around 52 seconds, a small flame appeared on one of the solid rocket boosters. Inside, the crew had no clear warning system. They could see something was wrong, but not what. Then, at 73 seconds, pilot Michael Smith said, "Uh-oh." That was the last full sentence. The shuttle broke apart in the sky, live, in front of those classrooms. What failed was a rubber seal called an O-ring. In warm conditions, it stays flexible and seals the booster joints. In the cold, it becomes stiff and slow. That morning, it did not seal properly. Hot gas escaped, burned through the structure, and destroyed the vehicle. But the worst part came after. The crew cabin did not explode. It broke away mostly intact. Inside, some of them were still alive. We know this because emergency oxygen packs were turned on. Someone reached up in that chaos and activated them. They were conscious. The cabin fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The air inside was failing, pressure dropping. Their bodies struggled to function. They were trapped, falling with no way to stop it. When the cabin hit the ocean at around 320 kilometers per hour, it ended instantly. What makes it even harder to accept is that this was not unknown. Roger Boisjoli, an engineer, had warned about this exact failure months earlier. He said it could lead to a catastrophe of the highest order, the loss of human life. The night before launch, he fought to stop it. He explained what the cold would do. He was overruled. The launch went ahead. The people who made the final decision were never fully told. Afterward, he told the truth, and he paid for it. He was pushed out, isolated, left carrying what happened. He later said, "I fought like hell to stop that launch. I'm so torn up inside I can hardly talk about it even now." After Challenger, things changed. Astronauts were required to wear pressure suits again during launch and re-entry, because without them there is no protection if something fails. That rule carries forward. The crew on Artemis II will wear those suits because of this moment. The rocket boosters used today have been redesigned with this failure in mind. And the culture changed too. Artemis II has already been delayed multiple times because now if something looks wrong, they stop. Because once those engines ignite, there is no escape. And in those classrooms on that morning, millions of children learned a lesson their teacher never meant to teach. Space was never safe. Challenger was supposed to be the lesson that ended this kind of death. 17 years later, almost to the day, the same willingness to look at a warning sign and call it normal killed 7 more people. And the worst part is that someone had prepared a plan to save them. The foam nobody checked. For 16 days they were alive. Not just alive, they were working, laughing, calling home, doing exactly what they had trained their whole lives to do. STS-107 was a science mission. For 16 days, the Space Shuttle Columbia circled the Earth while its crew ran more than 80 experiments in microgravity, working in shifts around the clock. The goal was simple: learn something new, push knowledge forward. That is what those 7 people gave every hour of their time to. Rick Husband led them, calm, steady. William McCool sat beside him. Michael Anderson managed the science. David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, all moving through their shifts, doing their work. And then there was Ilan Ramon. Ramon carried more than equipment. He carried things that mattered deeply. A small Torah scroll from Bergen-Belsen, a child's drawing of the moon by Peter Gintz, a boy who died in Auschwitz, a reminder that even in the worst places, people still looked up and imagined something better. Ramon said it clearly: "I feel I am representing all Jews and all Israelis." He wrote in his diary every day. He told his family he could not wait to see them again. At one point, he wrote, "Today was the first day that I felt that I am truly living in space. I have become a man who lives and works in space." They were not worried. Why would they be? But back on Earth, there was a question no one answered properly. During launch on January 16th, a piece of insulating foam broke off the external tank and slammed into the left wing. It struck the reinforced carbon panels, the part of the shuttle designed to protect it from the extreme heat of re-entry. That foam was not supposed to cause serious damage. It had hit other shuttles before and they had still made it home. But this time, the impact was strong enough to crack those panels, creating a hole. And during re-entry, that hole would allow superheated air, thousands of degrees hot, to force its way inside the wing and destroy it from within. Engineers saw it. Some were uneasy. They asked for satellite images to check the damage. They wanted to know if the wing had been breached. That request was denied. Management decided it was unlikely to cause serious damage, so they let it go. For 16 days, the crew worked. They smiled into cameras. They spoke to their families. They lived normally while a hole sat in their wing waiting. There was another chance that would have saved them. One team of engineers started thinking through the worst case. What if the damage was real? What if the shuttle could not survive re-entry? They worked out a plan. Columbia had enough supplies to last about 30 days. Another shuttle could have been prepared. The crew could have been rescued. It was difficult, tight, risky, but possible. They believed it could work, but that plan was never formally reviewed, never placed in front of the people who could approve it, because management had already decided there was no serious problem. On February 1, 2003, Columbia began its return. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then a small reading came in. The left wheel well was slightly hotter than it should have been, just a few degrees. Then more sensors failed, one after another. The heat was getting inside. Inside the cabin, there was no alarm that told them what was happening, just signs that something was going wrong. Then it got worse. The structure around them began to break apart. That hole in the wing had opened the way. Air heated to thousands of degrees was now burning through the inside of the shuttle. They would have felt it. The shaking, the loss of control, the moment where it became clear this was not something they could fix. No procedure, no escape, just seconds. 7 people, strapped in, facing each other, knowing. After 16 days of doing everything right, this was how it ended. At around 60 kilometers above Earth, the wing failed. The shuttle broke apart over Texas and Louisiana. It did not come down as one piece. It came apart in the sky. What fell to the ground was not just wreckage. It was pieces of them. Human remains scattered across fields, across roads, across people's homes. People looked up and saw it falling. Weeks later, in a muddy field in Texas, they found something that should not have been there. Pages from Ilan Ramon's personal diary. 37 pages. Torn, burned, stained, but still readable. They had fallen from nearly 60 kilometers above Earth, through fire, through everything that destroyed the crew. By every known rule, those pages should have been gone, reduced to nothing. But they were not. On those pages were his words, what he had been feeling while he was up there, believing he was coming home. He had written out the Kiddush, the Jewish Sabbath prayer, by hand, preparing to say it from space. He had written about finally feeling like he belonged there, like he was truly living the life he had worked toward. When those pages were later placed in a museum, one of the curators said something that still stays with people. There is no rational explanation for how it survived. The man was gone. His family would never hear his voice again. But his words came back. The investigation into the crash brutal. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board said NASA had failed to learn from Challenger. The same pattern, the same thinking. A known problem was treated as acceptable because it had not caused disaster before. But after Columbia, everything had to change again. The shuttle program ended in 2011, but the lessons did not stop there. The spacecraft being built today are different because of them. The Orion capsule used for Artemis II does not rely on fragile tiles like Columbia. It uses a heat shield designed to burn away safely instead of cracking. When Artemis I flew in 2022 and showed unexpected wear, engineers did not ignore it. They stopped, they studied it. They changed the re-entry path for Artemis II to reduce the stress. They delayed the mission again and again. People complained. But this time they did not call the problem normal, because 7 people once lived for 16 days, doing everything right, trusting the system completely, and were brought down by a problem everyone knew but refused to fix. These are the disasters the world knows about. But behind them, before them, beneath them, there is another layer. People and even animals whose names never made the headlines. People who were erased on purpose. Animals who died so that humans could learn how to leave Earth and were never thanked for it. The ones nobody remembered. On November 3, 1957, a small stray dog taken from the streets of Moscow was strapped into a metal capsule and launched into space. Her name was Laika. Before that, she had another name, Kudryavka, Little Curly. She had survived cold nights, hunger, and fear on the streets. That is exactly why they chose her. They believed a dog who had suffered would endure more. She trusted them. One of the technicians who cared for her could not handle what he knew was coming. He took her home for a few days so his children could play with her. He knew she would never come back. He still sent her anyway. The mission had no return plan. It never did. Sputnik 2, built by the Soviet design bureau OKB-1 under Sergei Korolev, was created for one purpose: to prove that a living being could survive launch and remain alive in orbit long enough to send back data. It was a sealed, cone-shaped capsule launched on a modified R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile, never designed to come back to Earth. The technology for safe return did not exist yet. Laika was sent to die. The world was told she lived for 7 days, that she died peacefully. That was not true. She died within hours. 5 to 7 hours after launch, the heat inside the capsule rose beyond control. The system failed. Her heart rate spiked. Her breathing broke. She died in panic, alone, trapped, with no way out. The capsule kept orbiting Earth for months. Her body stayed inside it until it burned up in April 1958. Years later, one of the scientists, Oleg Gazenko, admitted what they had done. "We did not learn enough from this mission to justify the death of the dog. We shouldn't have done it." But they did, and they kept going. Before Laika, there were others. Monkeys named Albert I and Albert II. One suffocated before his rocket even left the ground. The other reached space, survived the flight, and died when his parachute failed on the way down. A squirrel monkey named Gordo survived the launch, the weightlessness, the violent re-entry, only to drown when a flotation system failed after splashdown. They proved the body could survive space. They paid for that proof with their lives. Then came the humans. Some names are known, most are not. Valentin Bondarenko burned to death during a ground-based endurance test designed to simulate long-duration spaceflight conditions, alone repeating, "It was my fault, don't blame anyone," as his body gave out. Theodore Freeman died during a T-38 jet training flight, preparing for future Apollo missions. A bird smashed through his canopy. It barely slowed anything down. Charles Bassett and Elliot See were assigned to fly Gemini 9, a mission meant to practice docking in space before the moon program. They died in a crash before they ever got their chance. Their replacements flew instead. One of them walked on the moon. Clifton Williams died in another T-38 training crash while preparing for future Apollo missions. He was in line to walk on the moon. Someone else took that step. And then there was Robert Henry Lawrence Jr. He was part of the Manned Orbital Laboratory Program, a military space mission meant to place astronauts in orbit for surveillance. He was 32. He died in a crash in 1967 during a training flight, and then something worse happened. He was not recognized, not fully, not properly. His name was not placed where it should have been. It took 30 years for it to be added to the Space Mirror Memorial, 30 years of silence. He was erased once by death, and then again by the system he served. Michael J. Adams died flying the X-15 rocket plane program, a series of high-speed test missions that helped engineers understand how spacecraft survive re-entry. His aircraft broke apart in the sky. The data from his flight helped build the future of space travel. He was only recognized as an astronaut decades later. And then came the worst of it. On October 24, 1960, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a rushed missile test was underway. This was not a space mission. It was a Soviet military operation to test the R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile, a weapon designed to carry nuclear warheads across continents. The goal was simple and urgent: show strength, meet a political deadline, prove to the world that the system worked. Because of that pressure, everything was moving faster than it should have. The rocket was already filled with fuel. It should not have been, not with people still around it, but they were there anyway. Engineers, technicians, welders, men doing their jobs, standing close to something that could end their lives in seconds. They trusted the system. They were behind schedule, and that mattered more than their lives. Then everything broke. Suddenly, the upper stage of the rocket ignited while men were still working below it. The fire came down on them instantly. The fuel ignited on contact. It stuck to their bodies. It burned through skin, through muscle, through bone. Men screamed, they ran, but the fire followed them. Some fell and could not get back up. Some tried to help others and were caught in it themselves. Some were still alive as it burned through them. When it was over, the ground itself was blackened. Around 120 people died that day. The people who died that day were not named. They were not honored. They were erased. And yet everything that came after stands on all these people. They are the reason anyone ever left Earth at all. And after all of that, after every fire, every fall, every ignored warning, something finally happened that felt impossible. People went to the moon, and they came back. What 4 astronauts carried home. At 8:07 p.m. on April 10, 2026, the Orion capsule hit the Pacific Ocean. It had just come screaming through Earth's atmosphere at Mach 33, wrapped in fire, cut off from all communication for 6 long minutes as plasma sealed it off from the world. The heat shield took the full force, burning at temperatures that would destroy anything unprotected. Then the drogue parachutes opened at 22,000 feet. Then the 3 main parachutes at 6,000 feet. The speed dropped. The capsule steadied. It hit the water. 4 people were alive. They had traveled 694,481 miles. They had gone farther from Earth than any human since 1972. They had seen the far side of the moon, a place almost no one in history has ever seen with their own eyes. And they came back. But that moment was not just success. It was payment. The heat shield that brought them home was not perfect. Engineers already knew that. Artemis. I had shown unexpected erosion. This time they did not ignore it. They changed the re-entry path. They slowed it down. They reduced the stress. They faced the risk instead of explaining it away. That is why it held. The spacecraft was named Integrity, a word that means something holds together under pressure. It held because it was built from failure. The launch abort system exists because 3 men once could not get out. The pressure suits exist because 3 men once lost all their air. The booster joints exist because 7 people were lost on a cold morning. The heat shield and the decision to stop and fix problems exist because 7 more were destroyed by damage that had been seen and ignored. Even the delays matter. Artemis II was pushed back again and again. People complained, but this time they stopped instead of rushing, because they remember. Years earlier, Gus Grissom said, "If we die, we want people to accept it. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life." Less than 2 years later, he was gone. The program did not stop, it changed. And because it changed, 4 people came home.